Hello, I'm the Vortex, and in this video, I wanted to talk about mental health from a personal perspective, but also try and examine it in the context of the contemporary world. And I think probably mostly I'm going to be trying to focusing on men's mental health because obviously it's what I have personal experience with, but also just from culturally in the zeitgeist. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion around men's mental health and the looming crisis, or what the actual crisis we're in general, about kind of disconnected, lost generation of men who are feeling purpose, a lack of purpose. But I'm also going to try and talk a bit about just some reflections on that. What does it mean now in the contemporary age? What is it to be a man in the contemporary age? What are the challenges that we have, which are I'd say like exclusive to our sex, right, or our experience of our gender as men, right, as cis men. So hopefully this will be kind of interesting, and we'll probably go on for about 20 minutes. I'm going to try and keep it relatively structured, but just so you know what we're going to explore. So I guess I'll start with the personal experience, and again I'll talk about my own experience of mental health, mental struggles. How have I found mechanisms that work to be able to cope with turbulent moods? Because in my own case, I have a diagnosis of bipolar, which is a mood disorder. So that means that I have extremes of mood that can vary quite wildly, and it's something that I've lived with since I was 17. I'm now basically 40, so I've had quite a lot of experience with it, right? I might touch a bit as well on mental health for women, but obviously I don't really have any lived experience of that, so there's only a certain level that I can go to with that, because I don't really know what it's like to be a woman, right? Obviously, I never will know that. So let's start. So my own experience of mental health, yeah. So obviously I was diagnosed at the age of about 19 with my illness. I got ill around 17. It's typical onset disorder. Typical onset of the disorder. And how it manifested in me was I had quite a period anyway of experimenting with. In my case, I did smoke a lot of weed. I don't really consider it to be the trigger. I think prior to actually smoking weed, I had serious periods of depression, which I can now recognise as depression. But from the age of 14, 15, obviously I didn't know what was going on, so I didn't know what the word was for it really, but I have very vivid memories of being a young man, teenager basically, 15, 14, and just feeling, like most of the time I was fine, right? I'd listen to punk rock. I was a big fan of music. I was introverted, but I wasn't like without friends. I had a good group of friends. I had a community, a subculture that I was involved in, which was skateboarding, which gave my life a lot of purpose. Obviously, gaming, computing, all of these things of which I actually translated into what I do now, which is basically teaching. And I've kind of forged a career of sorts as an artist as well. And a writer and publisher and all that kind of thing, right? So it's interesting kind of looking back now, because I'm 40, obviously, basically, in a few weeks anyway. And you kind of obviously go through a reflective phase in your life when you start looking back and thinking like, oh, it's quite a significant date. In 40 years, the amount of time I've been alive, I'll be at 80, right? That is like, you'd hope by the point that you're 80 years old, that you have wisdom that you've cultivated due to experience, and wisdom only really gets cultivated through experiences which are either bad or good, right? And no life is free from both of those things. Like, obviously, the terrible suffering, well, not terrible suffering, but suffering. I think the Buddhists and the Buddha was right in the sense that there isn't any escaping suffering. That wheel is something that we all have to learn how to deal with. I suppose the real lesson of a lot of life, though, and obviously we all have peaks and troughs, is though how do you actually deal with that? Do you So if the world is broken, or a part of the world is broken, how do you try and go about fixing it? Like, how do you try and go about making it better? And that journey isn't like something that always even ends, but it's a constant call, or that you might feel within, I guess, to make things better, which can take a lot of energy, and sometimes it can be too much. But recently, I've just been thinking like that you've got to hold on to that aspect of, I guess, what Camus would have called the absurd hero. You know, like. So Albert Camus had this whole idea that like the world is well at its inherent meaning, like the word God and everything else, but then you have to like strive for that meaning to create it. So it's a process itself. It's very much a creative process kind of philosophy, right? And I see how in Myth of Sisyphus he expounds on this. Like, you know, if there isn't any meaning to life, why wouldn't you just end yourself, basically? But obviously Camus' answer to that problem is the absurd hero. So Sisyphus, really, rolling the boulder up the hill and keeping on going. And I've explained this in previous videos, so I won't have focus on that. But I think, obviously, skipping lots of parts, that is essentially what I think works for me personally, to be honest. And obviously, you know, I've been through pain. I've had things I've had to process. I've left the country that I lived in for basically 3 years. That's now an aggressor in a war. Which of course is because I lived in Russia for years, and of course that has torn that part of the world's soul in half, if you wanted to really put it poetically, I suppose. There's been millions of casualties in Russia. A lot of those men are just drafted, but then of course the crimes that they've committed in Ukraine are not something that are going to be forgiven very fast, right? But with that, I won't go too much deeper into that, but obviously I think a lot of that, you know, is just the unfortunate old age truth of just terrible, cynical sociopaths in power who put the poor in front of, give poor the gun, not even a choice, and just send them out to die like cattle, really. Anyway, I've gone rapidly off course. What I'm trying to communicate here is that, like, obviously that's another level. I'm in the West here. I'm in the UK. Even though the UK has its own problems at the minute, we are sheltered from the really, really, really huge seismic shifts that have been going on in the world. I actually wanted to recount about an example of somebody who I know, who obviously I won't use the name, who I met when I was, I think, in my late 20s. And when I met this person, I was an artist. I was involved in a studio complex, and they were having what you would describe as like absolute. They were in a depressive hole. Very intelligent man, musical, cultured, artistic. One of the nicest people I've ever met, kindest people, most empathetic people I've ever met. Now, obviously, this could sound like some vague self-insert that I'm talking about. It's not. This is a real person that I still know and have seen around and talked to, even in the last few years, right? Anyway, what I wanted to talk about was that person who when I first met them, they were incredibly depressed. They self-loathing, self-hatred. Again, like one of the kindest, most empathetic people or men I've probably ever met in my life. Incredibly creative and great writer and everything else. But at that point, when I first met them, they were unsure of themselves. They didn't believe that anything that they did was good, and even though they were kind almost to a fault, they were struggling, and they were clearly coming apart at the seams in some respect. Anyway, the thing I want to talk about is that person now is actually a practicing mental health practitioner who's been actually through the academia, who's done lots of qualifications, and is a practicing mental health professional, right, with a therapist. And I think that really I think one of the ways I think you must learn if you have any kind of mental health issue, whether it be anxiety, depression, something is more serious like schizophrenia. Elaine Sachs is a good example of a schizophrenic, someone diagnosed schizophrenic who's now a psychiatrist herself, right? And I think the biggest revolutions often in these kind of ways of thinking come from people who have been deeply touched, either by melancholia, depression, or even like hallucinatory experience, like people who have been touched by madness or mental health or suffering. It can do one of two. Well, I mean, I'm not just two things. You know what I mean? You can go one of two ways with it. Generally, you can, depending on what it is, the trauma. You can go. You have to process it, obviously, in some way. I mean, the way that works for me, obviously, is art. Like, I do a lot of art, and that helps me to. It's not purely just as a therapeutic. There is a larger pro artwork in my artwork, but also does have that also useful function of it just clears the mind, right? It clears the cobwebs out, and you can process. It could just be stuff that's ruminating over in your head, but also just the wider world. That is a good way to deal with it. Like, the whole thing of Carl Jung's "only the wounded physician can heal." This person that I'm referring to before, who now is a practicing therapist and successful and has done research and meaningful research into this area, there are ways that you can get out of whatever kind of ruminative rut that you might get into. I mean, I'm not unaware of this. I've had experienced plenty of it in my own life. I mean, part of the reason I just do these vlogs on here, which don't get a great deal of views anymore, even for some reason, but probably because I swear occasionally, to be honest, but is just so I can have a place where I can record these journals and put these thoughts out there to anybody. Obviously, I've always had a deep interest in philosophy. I always studied it at university, and that interest has never waned. It's always been in my work, whether that be in the writing, in the world of writing, or games dev now, which I do a lot more of, or indeed painting. It's that incessant need to express yourself, which doesn't go away. I mean, it can't go away. Like, if you are the artistic type of personality, which there is a lot of overlap with creativity in general, that especially with mood disorders, actually, there's a remarkable crossover rate with like artists and intellectuals, writers, philosophers, and mental illness, right? So. And obviously in culture we have this idea that the tortured artists, which actually goes back to the Greeks. They had this idea that personalities who are like melancholic could be very deep and like have insights, but also that the flip side of that insight was that you had it was like a bit like being stuck in a vortex. If you could learn to channel it, that was a good thing, and you could like really bring your visions to the world in a positive way, but that vortex could also consume you too as well. So it's a bit like, I don't know, if you had a ship in the ocean, you have to learn how to sail it right through the stormy periods, which is probably a pretty accurate metaphor actually for I mean, I still have to deal with my moods and my periods of intense like self ruminating, or like really feeling emptiness, really. But then emptiness isn't really. I mean, it's an abstract concept anyway, emptiness, but it's not really a negative. I mean, we have a very I think our notion of death is still, in the West anyway, is still kind of framed by that kind of lingering, whether it be Catholicism or Christianity, like the idea of all that monotheistic belief systems, right? Because whether you're an atheist or an agnostic or pantheist, like I am, or follow a religious order of some sort, the more like conservative interpretations of those belief systems do have this idea of like judgment and God being the judge and of behaviours, and because a lot of it's down to interpretation, it just gets kind of passed on, right? I'm not going to focus too much on that now because I've kind of gone off on a tangent. I'll talk a bit more generally because I said I was going to speak for 20 minutes. So the idea of what masculinity is has obviously changed. It's less fixed, but then, to be honest, like the nature of anything across time is dynamic and constantly changing. Like the only constant in the universe is entropy, right? Everything changes, everything. Entropy's energy systems like go into further disorders. They don't. Disorder only increases in energy systems, basically, in closed energy systems. And I think that's a good metaphor for anything really. Like, there's no like. I've kind of spoken about this in previous videos as well. Like, we do have a kind of weird culture now. The culture wars. I'm obviously not very conservative on that. I kind of think there's so many negative trends that have emerged in, I don't know, like conservative thought circles around, as a response to more open attitudes to, say, for example, trans experience or gay and lesbians, as they've acquired the equal rights that they of course deserve. But at the same time, I think there has also been, from certain quarters, of fringe elements, to be fair, but there has been a certain overemphasis on, like, you know, identity or sexuality being a huge deal. Like, I kind of see it like you can be gay, lesbian, bi, straight, and still be an asshole. It doesn't really mean anything, to be honest. There's been plenty of, but then, you know, obviously it gets analysed through like oppression hierarchies and things in there, which I guess some of that comes from Marx in some respects. The whole idea of the oppressors and the oppressed. But then, you know, again, I've gone off on a tangent again, but I do think Marx had in his analysis of capitalism and class was really interesting and insightful. I wouldn't go as far as to call myself a Marxist because I don't really believe his solution was correct. I don't think anything like communism could exist. The only way I actually think you could even achieve something with like communism would be highly advanced technology. And I don't think Marx ever really, I mean, apart from Fragment of Machines, obviously, which is a text he wrote around how automation could free labour from wage slavery, essentially, and, you know, that could basically create this automated sort of communist society. Anyway, I've even done a video all about the theory of that. Going back to masculinity, I think there's a lot of strange perceptions, like, or ideas going around. Now, I do think, I wouldn't say men are all stoic, because men are diverse. Like, some men are much more masculine, like alpha, I suppose, if you want to use that term, even though it's kind of redundant. And we're all different, we're all diverse. Like, it's half the planet, basically, still. So, well, probably a bit less than, but, you know, there's a lot of men in the world. But yeah, there's never really been a fixed type of man. There's always been different kinds of man. You've had your like kind of warrior archetype, your kind of magician archetype. This is all comes from Jung, obviously. You've had your leader. There's all kinds of types of man, same as there are types of women, right? And that's always been the case. Like, if you look back into ancient history, I mean, there's been examples of men who were men, but they were men in different ways, right? Because ultimately, I was actually thinking about this the other day, like, if you actually think about it, biologically, scientifically, women carry life, right? Without women, we are screwed. And they are, in that sense, they are actually divine, right? Now, that doesn't mean you put all women on a pedestal, because that's equally as redundant as saying, you know, all men are this, or all men are that, all women are this. It's just redundant. It's absurd. It's like, it's a tunnel vision that you've got stuck into due to some, I don't know, like neuroticism or whatever, right? But there's always been different kinds of men. There's never been a fixed notion of masculinity. Obviously, you can draw conclusions from, and there are biological factors and behaviours. Obviously, testosterone leads to increased aggression, yada, yada, yada. But I think one of the things that's happened in our culture that has created some disruption, there is the economic factors, of course. As a less industrial jobs, less traditional male roles, and more like the sort of managerial classes kind of assumed a kind of status and power. You've had less of a traditional place for men, but then that's been happening for a long time, but especially since the end of the post-war period, where, I mean, obviously in the Second World War, pretty much every eligible man was drafted into the army, and then they all came back fairly broken by the experiences you'd expect. Women had been doing a lot of the work that men would normally do, and in a way that did kind of kickstart a redefinition. But, I think sometimes on the more extreme end, you can sometimes get caricatures from both sides, right? From either the red pill kind of movement, where it's like, well, women are all like, they all just want your wallet basically, and they'll basically leech off you, that kind of cliche. And then on the other end, you've kind of got, all men and pigs, and none of them are loyal. They all just want one thing, and that's sex and domination and power and everything else. And, obviously those desires exist in varying degrees in every man. Like, I mean, it would be absurd for me to claim as a man with a sexuality and sex desire that I'm not aroused by images of women, or looking at boobies or whatever. Like, I mean, obviously I am, but then part of being a man is learning to regulate those desires and be able to, I mean, in the broader sense of the word, be able to, you need to know what to repress. There are moments when action is required, and that again, that's kind of like a defining aspect of masculinity, actually, a lot of respects, is, and I think, again, I know I'm rambling a bit, I'm going on all the tangents, but I think the contemporary thing that men should aim to do is synthesize, right? So Jung had this whole idea about the anima and the animus, right? So in every mind there are masculine and feminine aspects, right? So, I mean, I'm a man, for example, but then I have feminine aspects, like, to my mind as well. If you want, I mean, obviously it's kind of like very traditional, but it'd be more like a nurturing aspect would be more commonly associated with femininity, right? Traditional femininity, and that's obviously a positive thing. One interesting thought that I've heard expressed in a few other ways as well is that to be a gentleman requires that you're a man first. So you have to extol the masculine virtues, service, kindness to your elders, respect, love is one of the highest ideals, obviously, and virtues. But also, you do have to have a certain degree of like a locus of control of your emotions, because the thing is, men's emotions, when they become negative, we can be violent. That's the blunt truth of it. We have a higher propensity for aggression. I'm not free of this either, of course. Like, I've felt aggression and despair, and sometimes something that I actually am aware of psychologically as well, is sometimes I can have a bit of a victim complex. I mean, my mother used to tell me about this like all the time. Say, stop playing the victim. That was and mothers teach you harsh lessons, but necessary lessons, right? This is something I've learned from my own mother, to be fair. And I love my mum, obviously. She's great, but she was kind of quite stoic in her approach to, I mean, she was obviously caring and nurturing and everything else. And she taught me languages. She taught me the importance about learning about other cultures, and exposed me to a lot of that, even because she was kind of, that was her thing. She was a language person. She learnt German, French, everything else. So when we were young, we were kind of taught about those languages and about different ways of talking, and that's a nurturing thing. But then also, she didn't take any bullshit from me, so she very much like direct, in a sense, almost like traditionally masculine, maybe. I mean, that maybe was the masculine part of her mind expressing it, because obviously I'm literally a masculine representation in the flesh of half of her genes, right? So of course she's going to project a model of how to deal with the world. And then I got that from my dad as well, though, of course. So my dad is very, in a sense, he is a traditionally masculine provider kind of figure, but he's also got a lot of depth to him as well. He's quite an introverted person, so he doesn't really talk about that all the time, but he's really into like art, culture. It gets a lot of that in my family as well. My granddad had Goya books, I remember, in the house and stuff. But my dad came from a very working class background. He was straight into military service, but he never went to university or college. And I was given those opportunities, and I did go to college, and I went to university, and I was able to forge an interesting career in the technical services, and now as a teacher, right? My dad never got those opportunities, and he provided for our family so that we could have those opportunities. I'm not saying my dad hasn't had a great life. He's an awesome guy. He's been all over the world, working and also exploring. He's obsessed with history. He's very knowledgeable on politics, like insanely knowledgeable on politics. So obviously I learned a lot actually about how to really, in a sense, be a thoughtful person who also does consider the other side and doesn't just paint them as a demon or something like. And I think that's one of the biggest problems in politics really, is that someone who may be of a more conservative bent, for example, you just paint them as like, oh, you're just literally Hitler or whatever if you're kind of left wing, and that's just nonsense. And in nearly every single case, it's not true. So, I mean, whilst I am saying I had the most based centrist dad ever, maybe in a sense, but he was also he taught me a lot about the power of music and art. Even though, he worked and he had a job that wasn't artistic or creative in that sense, he still had outlets for those parts of himself, right? And as a man, you are a combination of your mum and dad and your experiences and people you've known and obviously everything else. But you are what you are. Like, you are who you are. And I think one of the problems with the contemporary red pill space, or whatever you want to call it, the manosphere, is, again, it's just like, we need to make a factory that just produces one kind of man. But that's never existed. A cultural factory, if you will, for one kind of man, like this ultra, masculine figure. Like, I mean, Andrew Tate's an obvious example of the kind of toxic side of that, where it's like, women are only attracted to shiny things. And yeah, sure, like a lot of women are, but not all women. Like some women find that very attractive. They find the idea of material things and like kind of status indicators is incredibly, it's an important thing for them and whatever. But like, I mean, if you're someone like me who's kind of more intellectual, then it's not going to be that much interest to you anyway. You wouldn't be attracted to them. So it goes both ways, right? And I think I'll finish this now. It's long enough.